This shouldn't need saying, but kind of does. It is an international movement, not a national one, but the focus of it is developing national tax sovereignty. And if you want to sit that within a kind of world-making view, it's the difference between having something that you call a state, in which people happen to live and it's not part of an empire anymore, or having that state be something which is representative of and responsive to those people, and itself has the international independence to be able to act as a state and deliver on what people ask for. But because of the obstacles to that national sovereignty, it's only with international cooperation and international movement. The 5 R's are just kind of the way that we think about what tax can deliver when the tax system works. Revenue and redistribution you are pretty familiar with, but in terms of our ability to fund the kind of public services and administration that people want, while addressing the many and overlapping and intersecting inequalities that scar all of our societies. People tend to think less about the other 3. Repricing, let me not spend any time on, but we do need the tax system to work if we want to change things like the relative price of things with social costs, like tobacco consumption or carbon emissions. If the tax system doesn't work, then we can't do those things. And we end up pretty consistently with things that do more social harm than we would choose. But it's representation is the one that we tend not to think about, and is probably the most important. The evidence is really consistent that it's the opposite of the rallying cry for independence from the British, no taxation without representation. It's the other way around. There is no effective political representation when we don't have a tax system that works. The reason for that, as far as the evidence kind of gets us to, is that people don't, by and large, except me, don't like paying taxes. And the fact that you are aware of paying taxes and feel like the government is spending your money is what makes, it's the kind of the grit in the oyster that makes people hold governments to account. And so that over time, a government that is more reliant on tax than any other source of income, natural resource wealth or foreign aid or borrowing, a government that's more reliant on tax is more responsive. So over time, it is less corrupt. The quality of governance is better. But it's more than that. There's a kind of magic to it, right? It turns out a government with the same size of total budget, where more of it comes from tax, will spend more of it on the things people want, like public health, and less of it on things like military spending, and more. For a given government budget and a given public health budget, if more of the underlying budget comes from tax, the money works better. If the money going into the public health system is more coming from tax, then the tax spending results in outcomes that are both better and more inclusive. Less people are left outside, right? For the same amount of money. Right? Tax is kind of magic. That's why we say it's our social superpower. It allows us to choose to organise ourselves as societies in ways that give us all the chance of better, longer, healthier, happier lives. Or, as we often do, we can screw it up. Right? And it's direct taxes that are the most important here. So it's taxes that you pay on income, taxes on profits, capital gains, wealth. The ones that are most visible and most annoying are the ones that really drive this relationship. They're also the ones that are best to reduce inequalities. So they're kind of best in each way. But politically, they're harder to do. It's much easier to say, no, we're gonna put VAT up a bit. Nobody will notice that. And it's the fact that it's less noticeable that means it doesn't give you this result in the same way. And it leaves you with higher inequalities. So representation is kind of the 4th R is sort of key to this. Reparations is a newly added R. The other 4 came from about 20 years ago, back when I was a happy academic, Nessa. But it is true that the only scale of, if you think the UK owes India, one former colony alone, something like $45 trillion just for what it extracted. If you then think about the scale of harm done by the countries that kind of moved first in the Industrial Revolution because of their imperial histories, even just the climate damage on its own. We're talking about a scale of reparations that goes well beyond anything that any country could pay, of the high-income countries responsible for those harms, could pay off the bat. The only way they're going to be able to do it is effectively to reverse what happened in that period of formal empire and pay flows of money over sustained periods of time out of national revenues. So tax is also the only way that we're ever going to get there. For example, just to put some scale on that, the kind of numbers we have on cross-border tax abuse by multinational companies and by wealthy individuals hiding their assets and income streams offshore give you something like $500 billion of lost revenues every year. If on top of that you had national wealth taxes everywhere, of the type that Spain has in place now, for example, you're looking at something like another $2 trillion. Now, what that gives you in 1 year alone, if you fix it, is enough to certainly to get you started on climate reparations, while at the same time every country, just about, would have significant resources left over to invest additionally domestically. So you're not just saying, we're going to fix this to pay back what we owe, you're also making life better here. There is a win-win because of the scale of this, if we were to address this set of issues together.
So was that those particular areas where money is being lost? Was that tax avoidance or tax evasion or tax avoidance? Was it?
So we try and avoid using the term avoidance, because lawyers like to use the term avoidance to imply that it's legal, when in fact much of tax avoidance is unlawful. So we talk about tax abuse being both evasion and avoidance. In this case, what we're talking about with multinationals, the offshore is pure evasion, it's definitely illegal, but the multinational aspect, because every day, two sets of lawyers walk into a court all over the world, one of them saying it's lawful, one of them saying it's not, and somebody wins and somebody loses every day. All of that stuff in the uncertain space, it's basically premised on having international tax laws, I'll come to this, but international tax laws that do not give you clarity about which country has the taxing right on profits that are effectively made between operations in more than one country. So our estimate is based on the one agreed principle that is never stuck to, but which is that you should tax multinationals in the location of their real economic activity. So the calculation is done by working out the proportions of activity in each country and then allocating the global profit according to that, and then saying how different is the outcome that we have today from if we were to achieve that. So it includes stuff that people achieve lawfully because the laws are bad, and also illegally because the laws are not applied.
Yeah. Great, thanks very much.
Okay. Here are some numbers I've already talked about. Flick. This is from an older state of tax justice, so we've been doing this report since 2020.
Do you want to say what the state of tax justice is?
Sorry, that's a very good point. Doesn't everyone know? The State of Tax Justice is an annual report that we started doing in 2020, basically to put numbers, and these are numbers at the level of each country in terms of what each country loses, but also what each country is responsible for in creating losses for every other country, because very often countries are on both sides of that. In terms of both the tax abuse of multinational companies and the tax abuse of wealthy individuals hiding assets and income streams offshore. Roughly speaking, of that $500 billion, about 2/3 of it is multinationals and 1/3 of it is wealthy individuals. But bear in mind, this is in a context where most countries do not have wealth taxes on most asset types. If we got to that stage, you might expect those numbers, the ratio, to look quite different. So it isn't that we think wealthy individuals are just a small part of the problem. It's just that they're systematically undertaxed, so the estimate of losses is lower.
Is Ireland included in that list, tax havens?
So tax havens, I wish I hadn't put that on the screen now. Tax havens is a term that we tend not to use, right? We have two other kind of flagship reports. One is the Financial Secrecy Index, which is focused on the secrecy that's necessary to allow both types of tax abuse, because if everything was transparent, it would immediately be obvious who was hiding what. And then the Corporate Tax Haven Index, which does use that term. The thing is, every jurisdiction, every state, is a tax haven to some others. And so it's not terribly useful. But on top of that, it's really racially charged. So it tends to have been used as a term to refer to places which are small, often islands with palm trees, and you'll often see that imagery used, which is basically a kind of a bit of sort of journalistic racist shorthand to say it's these little guys over there in the Caribbean. We never use it to talk about a place like the City of London, or indeed the Financial Services Centre here. But there is no question that these places are playing that role, and at a significantly larger scale than most of the places with palm trees. Is Ireland a tax haven? I want to say everyone and nobody is a tax haven, but yeah, Ireland's a tax haven, especially on the corporate side. But it has and does dip its toe in the water of financial secrecy for wealthy individuals too. And the numbers, which I'm not actually going to put up, but I can share the link with you. Effectively, Ireland plays a significant role in removing corporate tax revenues from other countries, and at the same time loses a bit here and there itself.
That's a question. Like the tax havens, using that term, that tend to, process the most amount of wealth, are mostly post-colonial countries. So having that way of distinguishing post-colonial countries from other countries or other states that also operate as tax havens is useful from that framework. Although I get what you're saying about the language being racially charged, but there's also that sort of decolonial historical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to people in the Caribbean, they are very clear about how this has been used over decades by the OECD, particularly to put them up against a wall while doing nothing about OECD member countries. But then, if you look at the numbers, right, actually the biggest actors by far are major economies. So on the Corporate Tax Haven Index, you do see a set of UK dependencies, but by and large, the UK has full legal responsibility. And so if you put the UK together with its dependent territories, where the UK ultimately gets to write the law if it wants to, they are the biggest single actor. In that number, something like a third, a bit more, is the UK alone, effectively, but with those dependencies. And the responsibility should be put firmly with the UK, not with individual dependencies, who often were pushed down that road by the UK itself, thinking this will be better than giving them aid. This gives them a future that saves us money, hooray, with all of the effects that you can imagine in terms of corruption and inequality, never mind anything else. But look, the second thing is just that the US is the biggest financial secrecy jurisdiction by an absolute mile, and getting significantly worse, and I'll come to that too. But then it's mainly European countries rather than former colonies that play the biggest role. While the losses, and I should have put this on the slide too, the losses are biggest in absolute terms in high income countries, but as a share of current tax revenues or a share of public health spending, for example, they are much, much bigger in lower income countries. And so they disproportionately translate there into things like unnecessary child and maternal mortality and so on, because a lost dollar of health spending has a much more direct impact. So there is a kind of win-win where high-income countries get lots of money back and lower-income countries get back money that really makes a bigger difference to their people. But we continue globally not to choose it. I feel like I've used most of my time in section 1.
Can I throw in another question to elongate, Alex? I apologise, but I think you've hit on an interesting point. From my experience advocating with the Irish government, often one of their lines is, yeah, no, we're not great, but why are you picking on us? Do you not know the US does way more damage than us? You need to fix the US tax rules. The UK and the City of London is even bigger than us. Why don't you fix their tax rules? And it's like, we won't move till those guys move, and those guys won't move till those guys don't move. And what I think we've tried to advocate is, yes, there's a truth in that, but Ireland sitting on its hands till nobody else isn't showing global leadership, isn't fulfilling the role it has said it wants to play on the global, what would I say, negotiation process. So how would you argue for any one group advocating in the country? Because I suspect that's the answer everywhere, that the importance of these international, processes. But behind the scenes, every country says, yeah, we're supporting this, but we know behind the scenes they're trying to undermine it because of a very narrow interest of view. Whether you want to answer this now, or I imagine you're going to get to this in the other ones.
I will, but one thing just quickly on that. That's a line that's much more convincing when it comes from countries that are not allowed at the table.
Sure.
Right, and who are being, say in about 2000, the OECD's big push against a set of non-members, including, ridiculously small places with no impact globally, were being put up against the wall, while Germany, the US, the UK, Ireland were nowhere near. But Ireland is at the table. It's at the table in the European Union, it's at the table in the OECD, and we have documented cases of Ireland actively using its power to make the outcomes worse. So it doesn't stand up. But in the spirit of positive advocacy to people who you want not to be completely pissed off with you, then accepting that argument and saying, yes, that's why it's crucial that you work together positively in the globally inclusive negotiations at the UN is kind of the answer to that. If they are serious, if they're offering the argument in good faith, then it's clear what they have to do at the UN. If in fact this was
not in good faith, though, because
no, and it's not in good faith publicly. It's often quite hard to argue it because these people don't know about these, and it's very easy for a government. We're acting, we are fully supportive of this negotiations. We have people on the ground advocating in good faith, and we know that they're not. And I guess that's a very difficult battle to have in terms of they're not in good faith.
I mean, two things on that though. One is the UN negotiations are categorically different from the OECD or anything that has gone before. Their positions are in public. There's a certain amount they can get away with doing privately behind the scenes, but the Secretariat is in a good place, and so they are not going to be able to do that the way they could with the OECD, or even using the European Commission, who are currently trying to get themselves a bigger role but not being allowed it because it's the UN, and that's not how it works. So there's kind of there is a moment to demand they show their hand publicly where they will have to do it, and either they're going to sit on their hands in the negotiations and try and get away with saying nothing, or they will say the public positions that they've announced, good or bad. But even if they're bad, that's a step forward from them doing it without accountability. So, there are opportunities here that we haven't had before, I think, for lots of countries. Nurses' salary is a way of, communicating those large numbers that don't really mean anything into something a bit more tangible. Every second I've been talking, and my word, there's a lot of them already, is one nurse's annual salary being lost from somewhere around the world, right? In fact, that would be slightly higher these days because the losses have gone up quicker than nurses' salaries by our rough calculation. Next, please. That's just that wealth number. The scale of what we could do if we were serious about this in terms of changing the prospects of everyone for a better life, including meeting the kind of the global financial challenges that we have, is very, very large. If you want to motivate people to work on this, not something else, the numbers alone should give you the way in, but especially coupled with the argument, the social superpower argument, this isn't some narrow technical piece. Is that my cue? I'm done.
The original one.
Okay.
I'll give you a shout at 5 minutes.
Okay.
So we're fine, about 15 minutes or so.
Cool. So just last bit on this, the kind of the two elements of this, right? But you guys do this, this. The technical thing is about, all of the work that we're doing, whether it's at the UN or it's national policy advocacy, is creating, or rather recreating, re-establishing the space for governments to pursue more progressive direct taxes, right? And across the piece, from wealth to profits to individual incomes, all of that all direct taxation depends on transparency about ownership, ultimately, ownership of assets and income streams. And that, in the world that we're in, depends on international cooperation to share the kind of information that isn't going to be made public, and much more publication of data about who owns what, data about the profits of multinationals and where their activities are, and so on. All of that is in scope in the UN negotiations, but all of it, while it goes quite quickly to being very technical, and it's the bit that puts people off working on this stuff, all of it at some level is fucking trivial, because it's the next slide that matters. The only thing that matters is about the public narratives. Governments will do as little as they can to offend the people who have more money. Your job, everyone's job, is raising the bar of what is as little as they can get away with, right? If the public narrative, because your media, like everybody's media, is owned by the same small group of people who belong to this bit of the population distribution, their interest in publishing things about how you can raise taxes on millionaires and they won't leave the country, you can raise taxes on multinationals and they'll still invest and make jobs, their interest in publishing that is minimal, because it's not their story, it's not their narrative. If government only hears those narratives, their space to say, the imperial common sense here, people, is that we shouldn't, threaten the goose that lays the golden eggs. You're stuffed before you've begun. And it doesn't matter how great your technical work is on the need for a beneficial ownership register or automatic exchange of information or unitary taxation or whatever it is. You are done because you lost the narrative. And we have all collectively lost the narrative pretty much everywhere. And if there's one thing that Tax Justice Network is supposed to do, it is this. We don't normally do national stuff, but we did earlier this year go in quite hard on a piece around all of the lobbying in the UK, the millionaire exodus myth, this idea that you tax a tool seriously and everyone runs away, just to show that it's complete nonsense, right? And obviously all of the media outlets that don't want to carry that story don't carry that story, but actually they all end up mentioning it the next time they run the same old story about the exodus. Halfway down, right? Some sods from the Tax Justice Network said maybe this is complete nonsense, and then they move on. But it's there, right? And we heard, the UK Chancellor echoing it back in comments to the media in Washington last week, right? And actually saying that their data now suggests that the exodus doesn't happen either, right? And you think, was there space there for her to do that before, the amount of coverage that our counterpiece got? Maybe not. And is it important enough, the UK as a global actor, to shift the narrative there for our role of kind of doing that globally? Maybe it is. What are your narratives? You know them in a way I don't. What are the narratives that you have to overturn to create that space? That's where to begin. It's not the technical piece. We or anybody else can tell you the technical stuff, or you'll find it's all there when you need it, but you'll never need it if the narratives aren't shifting. Right? That's it. Okay. Let's get on. Very, very briefly, there's kind of a few things. Again, you know all this, but just some dynamics to think of. This kind of shift back in the world to militarism, which a while ago felt like maybe it would never happen again, but here we are. And all of these things kind of affecting international institutions, most obviously the G8 becoming the G7 again, but having further impacts elsewhere in NATO and the UN and so on. The ways that the South is viewing the North has been quite strongly affected in some good ways and some less good by that. Double standards everywhere. You look, most obviously kind of the difference between sympathy for Ukrainians or Palestinians, but a set of wider pieces too, and pretty obviously in terms of the Human Rights Council and the Court of Justice, but also elsewhere. This role of the US stepping in as neighbourhood bully, kind of throwing stuff up in the air, the WTO, which was already screwed, the OECD, which had pretty much already failed, the two pillars, and now, with Trump saying that they won't apply them, even though the US is clearly the main country that held the pen through all of those OECD negotiations. It is the US that's saying this is done, and if you even apply it, then we will come after you.
So you're saying even though the US was what?
was the main actor holding the pen. So
Holding the pen, sorry.
the OECD process, this version, began in 2019 and it was supposed to be done by the end of 2020. Why by the end of 2020? So that they didn't have to deal with a US regime change. And it didn't get anywhere near. They thought they'd finish it a couple of years later, but my God, it's still open, it's still going. Because you had 4 years of the Biden administration who came in and completely changed everything. Both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 completely changed in early 2021. Pillar 1, which you don't need to know about, was written by an academic who the Biden administration hired about 3 months previously, and that's what the world now, after 2 years of talking about something else, had to accept was Pillar 1. Pillar 2 similarly changed completely, arguably for the better in that case. But at the end of 2024, when they hadn't got it in place, the OECD had created for Pillar 1 a caveat that said, using numbers about the kind of statistics of coverage, effectively said there is one country globally that will have a veto on whether any country can introduce this, and it's the US. And on Pillar 2, it was a kind of wait and see. We waited and saw, and what did we see? We saw Trump saying if anybody introduces Pillar 2 and applies it to US multinationals, we will introduce the revenge tax to take it back. So even though you are doing the thing that the superpower has told you, and you've had to suck up the complete reversal in 2021 because the superpower changed government, we are again telling you, if anyone needed any proof that the OECD does not work, that process is everything you could possibly ask for. Okay, last piece, this collective partial withdrawal from giving aid, from supporting financially the UN, from engaging in lots of things in at least something that you could claim was good faith, goes much further than the US, obviously, and it's kind of a significant bit of the context of what we're living in. But on the other side, this has created a bit of space, right? There's a certain amount of room now, and you can see it in different areas in the UN, where Southern leadership is less likely to be challenged, not because countries of the North are suddenly, seeing the world any differently. They are just aware that whether it's about how Ukraine has made people view things, or indeed Gaza, or the desire to have better relationships with countries in the South than Russia does, or than China does, and this being a bit more pointed than it was 5 years ago, say, there is just a bit more room when countries of the South and the G77 take the lead on something. It's not necessarily as likely to be shot down. That gives, some basis for the second point, that there's a greater willingness from those countries to take to the podium and make some demands without feeling like they're immediately going to be reined in one way or another through economic threats or other things. And then last point, it's just true, and this is really true on tax, you can see it really clearly, the amount of technical engagement and analysis of the opportunities that some groups of countries in the South have done to get to a position where they are now is really striking. And they, when the door creaked open in 2022, the African finance ministers passed a resolution saying that they were going to call for a UN tax convention. It came out of the blue as far as any country in the OECD was concerned, but there's 15 years of work behind that, both by advocates and policy people in the institutions, getting to the stage where there was confidence in the Africa group to then take that to the UN and do it. And that's really kind of the most encouraging bit of all of it. It's taking the moment and being willing to. Okay, please. So perhaps with another speaker talking on this, I will try and do this very quickly and just touch on some key points and maybe come back to things. The central piece of all of this, the thing that's agreed, there's an enormous amount of technical stuff and we'll see where lots of it gets to, but this is the underpinning. This is the first of the commitments in the terms of reference which has been globally adopted for these negotiations. That gives the rise to the central question, which is how do you make operational and define a fair allocation of taxing rights? What does that even mean? It also comes coupled with the implicit, it's only implicit, but it is clearly implicit, recognition that what we have today is not a fair allocation of taxing rights. We have a global allocation of taxing rights that is systematically distorted against the countries of the South but also imposes significant losses on almost every country in the north as well. And that in turn means that we all have tax systems that are less progressive than they would be if this thing worked properly. And that means that within those countries, both north and south, the effects are again systematically in favour of greater and deeper inequalities. Fixing this is the thing that fixes all of that. And then we can argue at national level about whether our governments are going to be more or less progressive, but in a context where they have the space to be as progressive as we might ask them to be. And then we know what the fight is, and it's contained at the national level. But we need to fix this before we get there. Okay. Within it, there's a whole lot of stuff going on. The biggest bit is the Framework Convention itself. There's a funny story about how this came to be a Framework Convention and not a different sort of convention that I will not tell, but it is kind of win for the South and the Africa Group in particular. What it means, though, like the UNFCCC on climate change, this isn't a one-shot game. It's not about getting everything we can in the next 2 years. It is creating, first and foremost, the global governance structures that will decide things forever and put the OECD out of business as anything other than a rich country's talking club. And if we get that wrong, you know, and this is the first and only chance we've had after 100 years, right? It's 100 years since the League of Nations started doing this as a club of imperial powers, and we've never had it back, apart from a brief blip after the Second World War where it looked like it might come to the UN and then it didn't. If we screw it up now, it might be another 100 years, so this is the bit. If we screw everything else up, this is the bit we cannot. There is then quite a lot of space for substantive content, and we could actually do within the convention quite a lot, and then within the two protocols, one of them on cross-border services and one of them on dispute prevention and resolution, quite a lot. But this takes us all kind of into the technical weeds, except for keeping the focus on a fair allocation and recognising that a key bit of that and a bit of the architecture that's needed is around transparency, including public country-by-country reporting for multinationals, so that a fair allocation of taxing rights can not only be done, but can be seen to be done, that all of us can hold our governments to account for doing this thing, and that the convention itself can be accountable. If we don't get that in at this stage, it's very hard, I think, to bring it later. And so I don't want to say we'd give up everything else, but maybe we would to get that bit right. I'm going to do the next slide in 3 seconds and then just finish on some last points. Yeah, let's just go through it. This is kind of a detail about what's in there that I'm very happy to come back to. But transparency package, pausing briefly here. ABC of tax justice, automatic exchange of information about financial accounts, so tax authorities know what's in financial accounts held offshore. Full beneficial ownership transparency, so who is the ultimate warm-blooded human being behind every company, trust, foundation, partnership, and so on. Otherwise, an enormous amount of corruption remains possible and a great deal of tax abuse, all of which relies on that not being present anywhere today. Country-by-country reporting. A global asset register is where you'd put a lot of that data together, a combination of publicly and privately for access by authorities. And then the last bit of the architecture of the framework body itself is a subsidiary body that is something like a Centre for Monitoring Taxing Rights, as was proposed by the UN FACTI panel, which is basically the central place that all of this data can be used and churned to evaluate proposals, publishing regular statistics, making it work, making it show that it's working. Okay. I have slides in detail on all of these, which I will not talk to, so please go just one by one. It's all in there, and I'm happy to come back or answer questions or respond to emails or things afterwards. And more. I'm not even going to talk about the protocols, although they're quite kind of fascinating in their own way. But state of tax justice. Oh Lord, I've got 2 minutes or something, have I?
No, you've got about 6 or 7.
Awesome. We'll take 3 on here. Okay. Right. So this year's report, the OECD, for the second time, has let us down by failing to produce the aggregate statistics from the country-by-country reporting, which is the only bit that's consistently supposed to be public in their approach. And that means that we don't have new numbers this year on the corporate side, which is very annoying to me. So the number is still 492. However, what we have done is 2 different things, which is kind of one is a political framing bit, and I'll come back to that in the last section, and the other is this policy opportunity around public country-by-country reporting. So basically we do two things. We look at the extent to which the US, within the data that we have got, the US is the biggest threat, or US multinationals on the one hand, and then the US as a secrecy jurisdiction on the other, and then the extent to which public country-by-country reporting. We began pushing an international accounting standard for country-by-country reporting in 2003. In 2013, 10 years later, the G20 and the G8 gave the OECD the mandate to introduce the standard, and they did, and they based it on ours, and then they made it worse in 7 different ways, and then they didn't require it to be public. And so we've been in the fight to get it public ever since. Where we have this data public, it increases the effective tax rate of multinationals by a few percentage points, which might not sound like very much, but this very quickly becomes hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. And the OECD has consistently refused to do it, but this year the European Union and Australia have begun, under great pressure from US lobbying, and the opportunity is there to make it global, because even a country as big as Nigeria or India has backed away from doing it because of the level of threats they get from the US in particular, but also the European Union sometimes. Doing it in a global context within the convention is the way to give everybody the cover. And that's a dynamic that works in other areas too. Okay, let's look at some of these numbers. So yeah, top lines, what we'll show, this is embargoed until the 4th of November, please. US multinationals shifted a bit more than a quarter of their profits, a mere couple of trillion over the 6 years we have data for, versus 17% of the profits of other countries' multinationals being shifted. So it is a significant difference in how much more aggressive US multinationals are. That, coupled with the fact that they are such a big share of multinationals, makes the numbers pretty big. So over the 6 years, they are responsible for effectively 1 year of losses in our report, but 29% of the corporate tax losses. They are the biggest players. And so it matters if the US has a leader who is saying, as he has said, if any country tries to tax US multinationals more fairly, tries to address their tax abuse, we will come after you. We'll come after you with tariffs, we'll come after you with taxes on your companies, we'll come after you with anything else that we can think of. If our governments give up on it, if they bend the knee to Trump, this is what they're giving up. And that's all of our revenues for our public services and everything else. And it won't stop here, of course, because imagine in the European Union, if you say we're going to apply Pillar 2 to everybody's multinationals except the US, you are going to have the world's quickest court case about unfair treatment, and you will be taxing no multinationals. Right? So it's the thick end of a pretty big wedge if that was to be accepted by our European governments. Okay. The other thing to note is that the distribution has shifted. US multinationals, like everybody else's multinationals, used to be fairly even-handed in the sense that they screwed their own countries as much as they screwed the rest of the world. However, since the Trump reforms that began in 2017, this has flipped, and now US multinationals are almost uniquely focused on screwing everybody else. They are still screwing people to the same extent, but it's all of us and not really the US anymore. Don't worry, the US still gets screwed. There are effectively 0 new jobs in the US from this, although an enormous amount of additional profit is being declared in the US. Basically, the US has become the favoured tax haven for US multinationals, but it hasn't done the US any good. No more jobs, no more investment, and slightly less tax than they used to get.
So how that harm is done
Is profits that should have been taxed in other countries not being taxed.
Is this basically Trump saying multinationals, you need to keep your profits here, but also saying to the rest of the world, if they're there, don't tax them fairly?
Yeah.
So there's 2 prongs to his
Yeah.
approach.
But one thing, this is the data that we have, because the OECD is on such an enormous lag, only goes up to 2021. But we have other data, and there's more of it in the report, and a bit of it I'll talk briefly about. But it is absolutely and abundantly clear that the Biden administration has not made this any better. Right? It's not that the Trump was a blip and now he's gone back to it. It has been a pretty continuous pattern. We may have slightly more enjoyed the way that Biden was screwing us than the way that Trump is doing, but it was the same process, right? It wasn't any significant difference.
Sorry, how does the US policy, how does it work in that respect? Like, how did the change happen? If so, the impact says US companies are paying less tax in Ireland, for example. As a result of this.
So what happened in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was the kind of the flagship Trump administration act. And what it did basically was to make it much more attractive to bring your profits to the US rather than take them through Ireland or Bermuda. Now, within the European Union context, it didn't make so much difference. So Ireland didn't feel it nearly as much as Bermuda. But Bermuda is a kind of case in point. Google basically stopped using Bermuda as a profit-shifting conduit, which took enormous amounts of profits through Bermuda and left a very small slice. But that's a lot of money for Bermuda. Instead, it all just went straight back to the US because the TCJA allowed them to engineer effectively as lower tax rate.
But is that not contributing to taxes in the US? Is that money not getting taxed in the US?
So I'm going to come to that, but because the rate that they could engineer, in order for it to be more attractive than leaving it in Bermuda, the rate that they could engineer in the US was so low, they ended up paying less tax. So there wasn't a kind of Laffer curve effect where the tax rate went down and the tax payments went up. Both of them went down, or at best, taxes were flat for a bit and then went down. But I think I may have that on the next slide or the one
So
after.
Uchizi has joined us. I think Uchizi can hear us, but is aware that we're finishing up Alex's last couple of minutes.
Cool, thank you. Great. So just taking some company data that's more recent gives you a sense of what happened to the ETRs, the effective tax rates paid by US multinationals in the US. So you'll see they had been pretty high and went down to levels that in some cases Ireland struggles to compete with. Now, actually, often the Irish effective tax rate has been nearer 5%, so there's still a bit of a margin. But bear in mind, all of this is before the successor to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is in the process of going through and makes it much, much, much more attractive to park your profits in the US. So this is the stage at which what Bermuda experienced is going to happen to Ireland.
Sorry, but was the US one of the higher? Did it have one of the higher rates for corporate tax then?
It had one of the highest statutory rates. It was a 35% statutory rate. And then you had state level taxes as well, which depending on the circumstances, the Apple number there is a bit of an outlier with things happening with Apple. Yeah, it's about kind of undoing lots of offshore parking that had been done. So it's kind of taxes being declared that year that actually applied to profits from a lot of previous years. But, the other ones tell you that this wasn't, it's not that they had 10 and 15%. They were genuinely in the 30s.
And that would be higher than most of a lot of the European, I know higher than Ireland, obviously, but than a lot of the European Union, would it?
Yeah, so most of the statutory rates, I think the EU average is something like 25, 27, and you normally pay at least a few points and often 10 points below the statutory rate.
For the most kind of capitalistic country in the world, it's a bit surprising to me. I didn't realise, you know what I mean? You wouldn't associate it with, like it sounds. Yeah, I mean, Trump probably thought that was communism, or it just sounds. I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, no, and it's often been the case that the US has really lobbied very hard around the world for things that are nothing like what it does at home. It also has unitary taxation at home, which it has spent the best part of 100 years trying to prevent the world introducing, which is basically the simplest way to get multinationals to pay tax where their activity is. That's how US states divide up between them the tax of the profits and the taxes of multinationals that operate in the US, but they won't allow it in the rest of the world. Discuss.
Can I ask a quick question, Thomas? So that's really interesting on two levels. So when the OECD process was happening, it was big news in Ireland. Every second week the Minister for Finance would say, don't worry guys, we're going to save the system, we're going to be fair and we're going to maintain our system, whatever. since the UN, there's been no media, there's no media coverage, there's no commentary coverage, politicians are very quiet about it, that if you say the potential for it are setting out, you know, a process like the UNCCC, the fact that the commentariat plus the Irish political system is so quiet, to me that would say to me is that they don't see it as a threat. And is that a real take on it? Whereas all the political noise is around tariffs, is around what that can have it. Is it that the system can't focus on two things? But actually this is more interesting, that irrespective of the UN tax system getting up and running, that if the Americans are successful in creating a better tax haven in America than Ireland, as you said, Ireland, what happened to Bermuda will happen to Ireland. There doesn't seem to be any commentary on that risk to our system the same way. It's all about the tariffs. Do they not know about this, or are they doing it quietly, or do they not want to talk about it? What would be the reason for that?
There's just a lot of inertia, you know, even in the kind of the niche tax reporting. You've got journalists who've spent 7 years working on the OECD, and they're like, really, there's a different place where this might happen? I'm not sure, oh dear. And the finance minister just said this about the OECD, so perhaps we'll report that instead of this. It's coming, right? Now the negotiations are happening, and they're tangibly there, and you can see your delegates online. It's building, but it's going to take, I reckon, another year before we get the kind of coverage of individual negotiating sessions at the UN that we've had at the OECD. The other thing is, you know, there's so much kind of Trump news, including on tax, that it's, you know, but yeah, it is going to come as people understand the threat more.
2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, really, very quickly. Next one. So just adding in, last point, the US holds, or its financial institutions hold, about 1/5 of the hidden wealth globally, again causing significant tax losses over the 6 years. So it really has become, I think in 2019, the US hit the top of our financial secrecy index, since when it has been deepening and increasing and this is all in the report, but you know, just to say, this is a good time for the US to be led by a cartoon baddie, because trying to get European politicians to understand this when the face of it was Biden, or you know, had it been Harris, no chance. But with Trump, you can just about get people to the point. And this is sort of the last thing I'm going to say is really on the, you know, where you are in Ireland. We are making, you know, the global framing of this is to your governments, to every government, is, you know, you've got a choice here. You used to be able to kind of muddle through and pretend that the OECD, you had some voice and you were getting something you wanted and blah. But that's gone, and it's clear now. It's either bending the knee to Trump, deciding not to try and take these revenues, not to defend our national tax sovereignty, in the hope that the orange child goes away, or you work together, right? You work together to be a big enough group that you can't be bullied in the same way. And the only place that's happening, because the US has an effective veto at the OECD, the only place that's happening is at the UN. And we should all be really grateful to the leadership of the Africa group who've got that to this point at the right time. But I'm not sure that plays in Ireland, right? Because you're looking at almost from the other end of the telescope. And so the question's kind of different. But you have a set of things that mean doing nothing is almost certainly going to be the end of the model. And so the question is, can you get your policymakers to the position where they say, we have to make a choice, we can't muddle through, and the choice we make is how we end the model. We can do it a good way or a bad way. Let's do it a good way instead of a bad way. You know, because of the competition from the US, if nothing else changed, over the next 4 years, I think Ireland's share of US profit shifting is going to be squeezed really hard. I think US multinationals don't trust Trump enough to take everything away. We were talking about this, but they're going to leave in place enough that they can come back maybe. There isn't going to be new investment for new profit shifting purposes. I can't see it given the pressure to pay tribute to the king in the US. Then you've got the volatility that Trump might wake up tomorrow and decide that he's going to put tariffs on everything that US multinationals export from Ireland or whatever else, and you know just strike out. And then the fact that the UN process, if it gets where it should do, quicker or slower, will basically make the model on the corporate side not work, because it will require that fair allocation in a way that will really fundamentally undermine the model that Ireland has. It may still work at the margins, but it will never be the kind of scale that it is now if this kind of goes where we think it will. So 3 choices really quickly. One is just you double down on it. You hitch your horses to Trump fully. You go full melee, as I say. So you don't just spend your time appeasing Trump and trying to stay on the right side of him in terms of tax and multinationals. You do it for everything, right? You say nothing ever about Palestine or climate or gender or whatever, and you just say we're going to try and be under this guy's wing for as long as he's here, and that's how we get through this. That's how we minimise the damage he does. As part of that, and kind of selling it to him as a thing we're doing out of loyalty, we will do our very best to undermine both EU and UN processes from getting anywhere. Right? And this is kind of the version. Or, you go the other way and you kind of flip all of that and you say, look, it's coming, the end is coming. And the only question is how we handle it. Do we come out as the bad guys, and do we end up with something that's really volatile where, you never know what's coming for the next few years? Or do we try and pilot a path through with others, with partners who want to do this, to something good? Take the windfall, right? Use that to smooth the way as the model fades out. These processes aren't quick, particularly in the UN. We will have a treaty to ratify by 27-28 at earliest. So there is a path out if people want to get on board and take a lead.
Can I just check something though? That's political choice number 1, from what you're saying, is the fact that it isn't Trump as such. This was the pattern that was happening. So even when Trump, or if he goes, the pattern will still continue. So it isn't about burying your head in the sand and riding it out.
Right. You might hope that there's never another election in the US and that it lasts forever, but let's not hope for that. Yeah, I don't think history suggests that a future Democrat administration is unlikely to undo much of what's being done on this front. So that alone, I think, is the end of the model at this scale. Okay, but what your politicians will no doubt do, because that's what politicians do, is this, right? Is try not to make a choice. Try and sort of stay on the right side of non-tax issues that people care about as a sort of counterweight to the fact that on tax they are actually doing version 1, and hope you get away with it. Right? So I kind of think if there's one thing for the people around this table to consider, it's what would it take to get them to the point where they have to choose, where they can't get away with this. But this is, as I say, based on my fully uninformed external speculation, and you may think there's a quite different way through this, or indeed that this doesn't hold. Let me finish there. Sorry for going so long.
Thank you.